The cold wind of that morning didn't seem to faze the millionaire as he stepped out of the car with firm yet detached strides. He wore a perfectly tailored suit and carried a brown leather briefcase. His gaze swept over the dilapidated building in front of him with a mix of curiosity and disdain. The orphanage was a stark contrast to the luxurious halls he was accustomed to. But today, he was there for a purpose, a substantial donation that would cement his benevolence in the society pages. The orphanage director greeted him with a warm smile, ignoring the tension hanging in the air. "Mr. Daniels, it's such a pleasure to have you here. The children are very excited to meet you." He nodded slightly, adjusting his tie as he crossed the rusty gate. Inside, peeling walls and makeshift toys told stories of struggles he could never comprehend. "Charming in its way," he murmured almost to himself. In the main hall, the children waited in silence, their eyes filled with anticipation. The millionaire paused at the center of the room, his commanding presence undeniable. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice clear but devoid of enthusiasm. "I've brought a gift for you all today, a contribution to this very special place." He didn't notice the curious glances some of the children cast his way, studying him as though they saw something others couldn't. When he finished speaking, the room fell silent briefly. From among the seated children, a small boy, with tousled hair and intense eyes, slowly stood. He hesitated, but there was something in his gaze, an uncommon courage for someone his age. Then, with a voice full of emotion and conviction, he called out, "Dad!" The millionaire froze, incredulous, turning toward the sound. "Dad!" the boy repeated, stepping closer. The other children began whispering, but he seemed oblivious. His eyes were fixed on the man in front of him, as though nothing else existed. "You came to get me, didn't you?" he continued, his voice brimming with hope, unaware of the impact of his words. The millionaire blinked, stunned. "What?" he managed, struggling to process what was happening. He looked around for an explanation, but the boy was already too close. He stared at him as though he had known him forever, without a trace of doubt. "I knew you'd come one day," the boy murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "Listen, kid, there must be some mistake," the millionaire began, trying to sound firm, but his voice lacked confidence. The boy, however, stepped closer, his disarming innocence carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "It's no mistake. I know you're my dad." He spoke with such conviction that the words seemed to strike a chord deep inside the man, an uncomfortable yet strangely familiar sensation. The room watched in utter silence. The millionaire, visibly uncomfortable, tried to piece together a logical explanation, but the boy's unwavering expression kept him rooted in place. He took half a step back, still bewildered by the scene. He looked at the boy as if trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "Dad," he repeated, as though the word didn't make sense. "Why are you saying that? Why do you think I'm your father?" he asked, his voice firm but laced with confusion. The boy shrugged, shaking his head as if the answer were obvious. "Because you're the man in the picture," he declared with the unshakable confidence of a child. The millionaire blinked, surprised. "What picture?" he asked, more curious now than skeptical. "Kid, I'm not your father," he insisted, but his words felt hollow even to him. The boy stood still for a moment, biting his lip in thought. Suddenly, his eyes lit up, and he exclaimed, "Wait right here. I'll be back." Before the millionaire could respond, the boy darted down the hallway, his footsteps echoing against the orphanage's simple walls. The millionaire remained where he stood, feeling the weight of the curious stares from the other children and staff. He let out a long sigh, running a hand down his face in an attempt to steady his thoughts. "What kind of mess is this?" he muttered to himself, glancing around as if expecting someone to clarify. Moments later, the boy returned, clutching something to his chest with both hands. It was a small notebook, its cover worn and edges frayed with time. He stopped in front of the millionaire, breathless, but holding the object as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Here," he said, extending the diary carefully. My mom left this for me." The millionaire frowned, looking at the notebook with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. Something about the way the boy held it gave him pause. At last, he took it, sensing that this small item carried more weight than it appeared. The millionaire held the diary as if it were made of glass, every detail of its weathered cover feeling heavier in his hands. He lifted his gaze to the boy, who watched him with an anxious hopefulness. "And what's in here?" he asked, his voice more hesitant than he intended. "I don't know everything," the boy admitted, twisting his hands together. "The ladies here said my mom left it when she brought me. They told me to always keep it. It's important." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I think there's stuff about you in there, too." The millionaire's brow furrowed in intrigue. With tentative fingers, he opened the cover. As he did, a photograph slipped out, fluttering to the ground. He bent down to pick it up, and when he turned it over, the world seemed to stop. It was an old, faded picture, yellowed with age. He was in it, years younger, smiling beside a woman who had her arms wrapped around him. He stared at the image, trying to process what he was seeing. It was her. There was no mistaking it. Her face, her eyes. He remembered that smile. It was the same one that had once captivated him. He tightened his grip on the photo as memories he'd buried long ago began to resurface. Is this your mother?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. The boy nodded, watching his every move with intense focus. "The ladies say it is. She left me here with the diary and the picture, then left." The millionaire swallowed hard. What was she doing with a photo of them together? Why had she left it here? His mind was flooded with questions that seemed to suffocate him. He looked back at the diary in his hands, knowing the answers might lie within. Taking a deep breath, he turned the page, aware that the small object he now held was about to change his life forever. The millionaire took a deep breath before letting his eyes glide over the first page of the diary. The handwriting was elegant and delicate, the letters slanted slightly, as if each word had been written with care and emotion. With every line he read, he felt a tightening in his chest. These were not just words, they were feelings, memories, confessions. "My dear son," the entry began. He paused, glancing quickly at the boy, who still watched him intently, then returned to the diary. "Today I leave you, even though it breaks my heart. I know this is the only choice I can make to give you a chance at a better life." The millionaire swallowed hard. The words carried a tangible weight, as though the paper itself grew heavier in his hands. He turned the page, and the writing continued, a mix of pain and hope. "I loved your father more than I thought I was capable of loving anyone. But his world would never accept someone like me, and I couldn't destroy the future he was building." He paused, as if needing time to process what he was reading. The boy said nothing, simply sitting down beside him, his feet swinging back and forth. The millionaire turned another page, his fingers slightly trembling. "I never told him about you," another entry read. "I didn't have the courage. He was already facing so much, and I knew that if he found out, he'd do anything to stay with me. But that would have come at too high a price for all of us." The words began to blur in his mind. He closed the diary for a moment, resting his elbows on his knees and holding his head in his hands. "Why didn't she ever tell me?" he murmured, more to himself than to the boy beside him. He knew there were no easy answers, but something inside urged him to keep reading. As he continued, the millionaire felt as if the words were pulling him back into a past he had tried to forget. "When we met, I believed nothing could tear us apart," the delicate handwriting confessed. "But I was wrong. His world had barriers I could never cross." These sentences stirred memories of the beginning. The stolen glances, the hands clasped under a table. It had been a pure love, but one born into circumstances that seemed destined for heartbreak. "When I found out I was pregnant, my joy was shadowed by unbearable fear," the diary went on. "I knew he would do anything to stand by me, but I also knew what that would cost him. His family, his business, everything he'd worked so hard to build would crumble." The millionaire paused, guilt stabbing at him. He knew how controlling his mother had been, how she quashed anything that didn't fit into the rigid framework she had designed for his life. The words on the page stirred fragmented memories. Her laughter as she told stories, the soft scent of her perfume that lingered like a comforting presence. He remembered how happy he had been with her, even amidst the challenges. But at the same time, the suffocating presence of his mother and the pressures of his world had made their love a ticking time bomb. He closed the diary briefly, trying to catch his breath. He knew there was more to read, but he already felt the weight of what lay ahead. The millionaire's mind drifted as he held the diary, the words bringing back memories he thought he'd buried. He recalled the day he met her, an unexpected encounter at a small, cozy cafe, far from the grandeur of the social halls he frequented. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, her vibrant energy and radiant smile brightening even the darkest corners of his life. At first, it had all seemed simple. He took her to discreet places, walks in parks, or quick trips to quiet destinations. With her, the world slowed down. He could just be a man, free from the weight of an important surname or the expectations of a powerful family. She made him laugh, challenged him, and made him feel as though he could truly be free. But even in their happiest moments, a shadow loomed over them. He knew his mother would never accept their relationship. She wanted him to marry someone of status, a woman who could strengthen the family's business and social ties. They had a favorite spot in a park where they would meet often, and a song they listened to in his car with the windows rolled down. These were small moments, but they carried profound meaning. "Do you think this will last?" she asked him once as they watched the sunset. He remembered hesitating before answering. "I hope so," he said, holding her hand tightly. But even as he spoke, a part of him knew their love was fighting against forces beyond their control. Deep down, he wished the world could be different. He wanted to introduce her to his circle, to show everyone how much she meant to him. But reality was unforgiving, and the pressures of his world grew stronger by the day. Still, he clung to every moment with her as if it were the last. The millionaire continued reading, each word piercing him like a dagger. The writing in the diary grew increasingly strained, almost trembling on the lines. "It was supposed to be a happy day," began the new entry. "I had just found out I was pregnant. I was still in shock, but at the same time excited. I thought about his smile, about how happy he would be to know we were going to be a family." She described the moment in vivid detail. "I was in his mansion in the bedroom we used to share, holding the pregnancy test in my hands. He had left for an important meeting, and I knew I would tell him everything as soon as he returned. But as I stood there, thinking about how to say it, the door opened without warning." The millionaire gripped the diary tightly, almost dreading what came next. It was his mother. She walked into the room as if she owned the place, and maybe she did. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on me, and on the pregnancy test I was still holding. She didn't have to ask any questions. 1 second of silence was all it took before her expression shifted to pure indignation. "What is this?" she asked, her voice low but cutting. His chest tightened as he read on. "I couldn't lie. I was vulnerable, still trying to process everything." "It's what it looks like," I replied, trying to stay calm. But the truth was, I was terrified. And she knew it. The next words made him freeze. She stared at me for a long moment, then walked up and snatched the test from my hand as if it were evidence of a crime. "You think this will secure your place here?" she said, her tone cold and cruel. "You think he'll give up everything for you?" Anger surged in him as he continued reading. I tried to explain, tried to tell her I loved him and that he had a right to know. But she just laughed. "Love? Do you really think love is enough? You'll ruin his life. He has a legacy to fulfill, a family to honor. And you're just a burden." The next entry detailed how the threats began. She didn't stop there. She said that if I told him about the pregnancy, she'd destroy me. "You'll never find peace," she declared. "I'll make sure you can't get a job, a home, anything. And as for your child, he'll grow up with nothing because you were selfish enough to stay." The choice became inevitable. I knew that if I stayed, I would put everything at risk, not just for myself, but for him too. She made it clear that she would turn my life, and my baby's life, into a living hell. The millionaire's hands trembled as he closed the diary briefly. He had always known his mother was controlling, but he had never imagined she would go to such lengths. His mind swirled with questions and regret. Worst of all, he now knew that she had stolen not just the love of his life, but the chance for him to know he was a father. Taking a deep breath, he turned another page, knowing the story was nearing a breaking point. The words written by the woman he had loved were now steeped in pain, reflecting the most difficult moment of her life. After that conversation, everything changed. I knew I couldn't tell him, and it broke me. He had a right to know, but she made me believe that staying would destroy everything he was working to build. She described the following days as a whirlwind of emotions. I tried to act as if everything was normal. When he came home and hugged me, saying how much he missed me, my heart broke a little more. Every part of me wanted to tell him the truth, but every time I opened my mouth, I heard her voice in my head. "You'll ruin everything." I was trapped between my love for him and the need to protect his future. The millionaire remembered those weeks. He had noticed her growing distant, but had attributed it to stress or exhaustion. He could never have guessed she was carrying such a heavy secret. I started making plans to leave, even though I didn't know where to go. I had nothing but a small savings account, and the thought of raising a child alone terrified me. But what terrified me more was the thought that if I stayed, she would follow through on her threats. She would destroy not just me, but him too. The final decision came quietly, almost cruel in its simplicity. One night, he was asleep beside me, and I watched him for hours. Every time I thought about leaving, something inside me screamed to stay. But I knew it wasn't an option. If I stayed, it would bring pain to both of us. He would lose everything, and I could never forgive myself for that. So, I did what I thought was right. The goodbye was silent, without words. The next morning, I packed my things while he was at work. I wrote a letter, explaining everything, rewriting it so many times that my hands ached. But at the last moment, I realized no explanation would be enough. He would never understand, because his love for me was as deep as mine for him. So, I left the note blank. It was easier to disappear. The millionaire closed his eyes, a sharp pain constricting his chest. He remembered that morning vividly, coming home to find the room empty. He had searched for her, tried to make sense of what had happened, but there had been no trace, no clues. Now reading these words, the pain felt as raw as the day she left. I left the mansion and went to a place where no one could find us. With every step, it felt like I was tearing a piece of myself away. I loved him, but I had to love him enough to let him go. The words were smudged, perhaps by tears. The millionaire felt his own eyes sting. He had never imagined her love had been so profound, so selfless. Closing the diary for a moment, he realized the weight of this secret wasn't hers alone. He, too, had been a victim of a situation that should never have existed. His mother, his world, everything had conspired to keep them apart. And at the center of it all was the boy, staring up at him with eyes that seemed to hold all the answers he had never been given. The millionaire turned the page, and the tone of the diary shifted. It was no longer about the pain of leaving, but the desperation and struggle of moving forward alone. I didn't know where to go. Every choice felt wrong. Every path seemed impossible. All I had was a small suitcase, the diary, and the photo I'd taken with him last summer, when everything still felt right. My heart was in pieces, but I had to be strong for him, for our child. She wandered for weeks, searching for a place to start over. I spent nights in rented rooms and days walking the streets, looking for something I couldn't name. The money ran out quickly, and I knew I couldn't keep going like that. One day, I walked into a church, seeking solace, and it was there that I found the answer I didn't want to accept. The millionaire felt the weight of those words. He already knew what was coming, but his heart clenched as he read. The Mother Superior greeted me with kindness, her eyes recognizing the desperation I carried. When I told her my story, she listened in silence, without judgment. In the end, she told me about an orphanage in a nearby town, a safe place where children were cared for. She assured me my son would have a chance to live with dignity, even if I couldn't provide it myself. The millionaire's grip on the diary tightened as he imagined the moment she made the decision to give up their baby. I spent the whole night holding him in my arms, crying, trying to memorize every detail of his face, the sound of his breathing. I knew that when the sun rose, I would have to leave him. It was the longest and shortest night of my life. In the end, all I could do was hold his tiny hand and promise that he would have a better life than I could ever give him. The description of the handoff was devastating. When I arrived at the orphanage, I was greeted by a woman with a soft voice and a sad smile. She took my son from my arms so gently that, for a moment, I almost let myself believe he would be safe. But it didn't lessen the pain. I felt like I was leaving a piece of myself behind. Before leaving, she left the diary and the photo as the only connections between the past and the future. I wrote everything I could about myself and about him in the diary. I didn't know if he'd ever read it, but I needed him to know he was never abandoned out of a lack of love. And the photo, it was the only proof that, for a time, we were a family, even if he'd never remember it. As he finished the entry, the millionaire felt the weight of her choices pressing down on him. Her pain spilled from the pages and into his own heart. She had been forced to make the most agonizing decision, all out of love, all to protect the future she believed they deserved. He turned to look at the boy beside him, who seemed so small and fragile, just like the words he had read. The billionaire made a silent promise to himself. He would do whatever it took to make things right. Closing the diary slowly, his eyes fell on the boy sitting next to him. The child seemed tiny, still swinging his legs off the edge of the bench, watching the man intently, waiting to see what he would do next. For a moment, the millionaire was at a loss for words, simply observing the boy and wondering how he had gone his entire life not knowing about someone so important. "Did you know anything about what's written in here?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. The boy glanced at the diary and shook his head. "No. I knew it was my mom's, but I never read it. The ladies here said it was about you." He paused, frowning slightly, as if searching for the right words. "You're him, right? The man in the picture." The millionaire held the photo in his hands, running his thumb over its edge before showing it to the boy. "This picture," he began, but his voice faltered. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "This woman is your mom. And this is me." He pointed to himself as if affirming the obvious, but the boy's eyes widened with wonder. They glistened with a mix of awe and excitement. "So it's true? You're my dad?" he asked, leaning in closer. The millionaire felt the weight of the question, but he knew he couldn't deny it. He nodded slowly, and a small, genuine smile broke across the boy's face. "I knew it. Nobody believed me, but I knew." Setting the diary aside, the millionaire leaned forward, trying to level himself with the boy's gaze. "I'm sorry I wasn't here before. I didn't even know you existed." He paused, his voice faltering under the weight of his guilt. "But I know now, and I'll do everything I can to make this right." The boy hesitated for a moment, as if sizing up the man in front of him. "Are you going to stay? Or leave like everyone else?" The question was direct, and the millionaire felt its weight. He hadn't expected a child to cut so deep, but here he was, waiting for an honest answer. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly, his voice carrying a certainty he hadn't felt in years. "I promise I won't leave you alone again." He extended his hand, and the boy eyed it warily before finally taking it. It was a small gesture, but to the millionaire it felt like the start of building a bridge between them. The boy seemed to relax slightly, and a hint of his personality began to shine through. "So, you're really rich? Like a millionaire?" he asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. The question made the man chuckle softly. I am. But that doesn't matter right now. The boy shrugged. Oh, it matters. We have a lot of broken stuff here. His honesty drew a brief laugh from the millionaire, the first he'd had in a long time. He tousled the boy's hair, feeling something he couldn't quite name. Connection, maybe, or pride. It was new, and it was powerful. We'll fix that too. But first, there are more important things to take care of. The boy tilted his head, curious. Like what? The millionaire picked up the diary again, holding it with resolve. We need to find your mom. Together, the boy smiled again, brighter this time. So, you're really staying? The millionaire placed a firm hand on his shoulder. I'm not going anywhere. The millionaire and the boy sat on a wooden bench in the orphanage courtyard. The man held the diary in his hands, turning it slightly as though drawing strength from its weight. The boy watched him expectantly, his expression a mix of hope and fear, as though bracing himself for something he didn't want to hear. Listen, kid, there's something important I need to tell you, the millionaire began, finally meeting the boy's curious eyes. He took a deep breath, carefully choosing his words. I need to leave for a little while. I have to find your mom. It's the only way we can make this right. The boy frowned, and the tentative smile that had been forming on his face vanished. You're leaving, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. You're going to leave me here? It's not like that, the millionaire replied quickly, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. I'm not abandoning you. Never again. I promise. But for us to truly be together, like a real family, I need to bring your mom back. She deserves to be with us. The boy looked down, kicking at a small rock on the ground. What if you don't come back? Nobody ever comes back after they leave here. His voice was hard, but it carried a vulnerable edge that made the millionaire's chest tighten. The man crouched down to meet the boy's eye level, holding both of his hands firmly. I will come back. That's a promise. I didn't know about you before, but now that I do, nothing in this world will keep me away. Do you understand? Nothing. The boy looked up, his lips trembling slightly. Then why can't I go with you? I'm strong. I won't get in the way. The millionaire smiled softly, a look filled with warmth. I know you're strong. You've been through so much, more than I ever had to face. But this search won't be easy. I need to make sure you're safe while I figure everything out. When I come back, the first thing I'll do is take you home. For real? The boy asked, his eyes shimmering with cautious hope. For real, the millionaire said firmly. He gave the boy's shoulders a gentle squeeze. I'll take you to my house. And we'll do this the right way, you, me, and your mom. Together. As a family. We'll never be apart again. The boy hesitated, doubt flickering in his expression. But something in the man's voice reassured him. Slowly, he nodded and wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his shirt. Okay, I'll wait. But don't take too long, okay? I hate it here. The millionaire pulled the boy into a tight hug, holding him as if he'd never let go. I won't take long. And when I come back, we're going home. I promise. The boy hugged him back, hesitantly at first, then with all the strength his small arms could muster. It was as though that simple, silent gesture was his way of trusting, for the first time, that someone would return for him. The weeks that followed were an emotional whirlwind. The millionaire knew finding his former lover wouldn't be easy. The diary held limited information, and it had been over 7 years since she'd disappeared from his life. He started by reaching out to old acquaintances, but most had lost touch with her, or had never known she'd left at all. The first confrontation was with his mother. Sitting in her office, the diary clutched in his hands, he faced her with a resolve he'd never shown before. You knew all along, didn't you? He demanded, his voice heavy with anger. For a brief moment, his mother faltered, but she quickly regained her icy demeanor. I did what was necessary, she said coldly. She wasn't good for you. What happened after that wasn't my fault. Not your fault, he shouted, slamming the diary onto her desk. You threatened her. You forced her to leave, alone and pregnant. And I never even knew I had a son because of you." His mother, though composed, looked unsettled. Still, she offered no clear answers about where the woman might be. Determined, the millionaire hired a private investigator. In the days that followed, he combed through records and spent sleepless nights poring over the diary, trying to piece together the puzzle. Bit by bit, clues began to emerge. A small town, a humble job, addresses that changed frequently, as though she'd been running from something or someone. When he finally tracked down a consistent address, he felt a surge of relief and anxiety. What if she doesn't want to see me? He asked himself repeatedly. But there was no turning back. He had to face the past, regardless of the outcome. The drive to the town was long, and the house was modest, surrounded by a weathered wooden fence. The garden was small but neatly tended, with rows of flowers that spoke of quiet care. He parked the car but stayed seated for several minutes, summoning the courage to take the next step. When he finally stepped out and approached the door, each step felt heavier than the last. He knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness of the neighborhood. For a moment, he thought no one was home. Then he heard the lock turn. The door opened, revealing a face he would never forget. Despite the years, she was unmistakable. Her eyes widened as they locked onto his, and she gripped the doorknob as though to steady herself. "You," she whispered, her voice laden with disbelief. "It's me," he replied, his voice quiet but steady. He held the diary to his chest like a shield. "Can we talk?" She hesitated, her eyes scanning his face as if searching for answers. At last, she stepped aside and opened the door wider. "How did you find me?" she asked as he stepped inside and took in the simple, welcoming interior of her home. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, turning to face her. "But I had to find you. I needed to see you, and I needed to know the truth." He held out the diary. Her eyes fell on it, and she stared as if it were a relic from another lifetime, something she never expected to see again. Tears welled up, but she hardened her expression. "You read it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did. All of it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And now I know how much you went through, what you did for me, for our son, and how my mother destroyed everything." She turned away, her hands trembling. "You have no idea what it was like. You can't just show up after all these years and expect to fix everything." "I know I can't change the past," he said, his voice firm. "But I can try to fix the present for you, for him. He deserves that." At the mention of their son, her composure cracked. A single tear rolled down her cheek. "Is he okay?" she asked softly. "He's waiting for us. For me and for you. We can be a family. It's not too late." Her eyes searched his for a long moment, torn between hope and fear. "Finally," she whispered, "tell me everything." She sat in a small armchair by the window, arms crossed as if shielding herself from the weight of the words she knew were coming. He remained standing for a moment, watching her with a mix of guilt and tenderness before finally sitting on the sofa across from her, the diary resting on his knees. "I read it all," he began, his voice low but steady. "But I need to hear it from you. I need to understand what really happened, why you didn't tell me, why you left without a word." She let out a bitter laugh, one laced with pain. "You think it was easy? You think I wanted to leave without telling you anything? I didn't have a choice." Her gaze stayed fixed on the floor, unable to meet his. "My mother," he murmured, already knowing the answer. "Yes," she said, lifting her tear-filled eyes to him. "She came to me. She saw the pregnancy test and what she said, what she promised to do. I couldn't fight her. I was just a girl. No money, no support. How could I stand up to someone like her?" He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, guilt etched into his face. "She should never have done that. I should never have let her have so much control over my life. I'm so sorry for everything. It wasn't just her fault," she said firmly, her voice gaining strength. "You didn't see it. You were so busy trying to please her, trying to be what she wanted, that you missed what was right in front of you. I loved you, but your world, it would never accept me. He closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. I was blind, young and stupid, but that doesn't excuse any of it. It doesn't change the fact that you had to go through all of this alone, that you had to make such a huge sacrifice. I didn't do it just for you, she said, her voice cracking. I did it for our son. I had to protect him. She said she'd ruin my life, and I knew she could. But more than that, I believed she'd ruin yours too. I couldn't risk it. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken emotions. He looked at her, searching for the right words. I looked for you, he finally said. After you left, I tried to find you. For years. But my mother never said a word. Never gave me a single clue. I thought you just decided to leave. She rubbed her eyes, sighing deeply. I left a note. A blank one, because I thought it would be easier that way. I thought if you didn't know why, maybe you'd forget me faster. Forget you, he said, shaking his head in disbelief. I never forgot you. I never stopped wondering what went wrong, why you left. He paused, his voice filled with quiet resolve. And now that I know, I won't make the same mistakes. She looked at him cautiously, her expression guarded. What do you expect to happen now? I want to fix this, he said, leaning forward. I want to bring you back into our lives. Into his life. He allowed a small smile to touch his face, one laced with hope. He's waiting for us. For me and for you. He deserves to know his mother. He deserves a family. She shook her head slightly, struggling to believe. After all this, you really think we can be a family? Yes, he replied without hesitation. It won't be easy, and it will take time, but we can do this. Together, days later, the millionaire returned to the orphanage. His steps were lighter, but his heart still carried the weight of anticipation. In the passenger seat of his car, she sat nervously, fidgeting with her hair as her eyes fixed on the orphanage's worn facade, her face a mask of apprehension. Are you ready? He asked, pausing to look at her. She took a deep breath and nodded, though her expression betrayed her unease. I don't think I'll ever be completely ready, but I'm here. For him. Together, they walked through the gate, greeted by curious glances from the children and staff. The director, familiar with the millionaire, gave a warm smile, but his focus was elsewhere. In the corner of the courtyard, the boy played soccer with a group of other kids, kicking an old scuffed ball. There he is, the millionaire said softly. She followed his gaze, and the moment her eyes landed on the boy, they filled with tears. She didn't need an introduction. Deep in her soul, she knew this was the son she had left behind so many years ago. The millionaire approached the boy first. Hey, champ, he called, smiling. The boy turned, immediately dropping the ball and sprinting toward him. You came back, he exclaimed, throwing himself into his father's arms. I promised, didn't I? The man lifted him up, holding him tightly before setting him back on the ground. But I didn't come alone. The boy frowned, looking from his father to the woman approaching slowly, hesitantly. When their eyes met, she froze, as though rooted to the ground. The boy stood still for a moment, then asked in a barely audible voice, Are you my mom? Her words caught in her throat. Yes, she finally managed, her voice breaking. It's me, son. The boy blinked, as if trying to process what he'd just heard, and then took a step forward. You came to get me? She fell to her knees, tears streaming freely now. I never wanted to leave you. I never should have left. She opened her arms, waiting, and the boy ran to her, throwing himself into her embrace. The millionaire stood nearby, watching the scene with a small, emotional smile. He knew this was only the beginning of a long journey, but at this moment, they were together. And that was all that mattered. After a while, the boy pulled back, wiping his tears on his sleeve. So now we're going to be a family, he asked, looking between them. The millionaire knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder while taking hers in the other. Yes, we are. The three of us. Together. And we'll never be apart again. The boy's face lit up with a smile that could rival the sun. He held their hands tightly, as though afraid they might slip away. She laughed softly through her tears, and the millionaire felt a wave of relief and joy wash over him, emotions he hadn't felt in years. As they left the orphanage together, the boy kept a firm grip on both their hands. Outside, the millionaire's car waited, but he made a point to walk slowly, savoring every second of this new beginning. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally on the right path, the path to the family he never knew he could have. The story of the millionaire, the woman he loved, and the son he discovered late, but never too late, is a powerful example of how true love can endure time and the most difficult circumstances. They show us that, although the past cannot be changed, the future can be rewritten with courage, forgiveness, and dedication. If you could send a message to the boy now that he's with his parents, what would you say to him? What advice would you give to help him trust again and embrace this new family? Did you enjoy this story? Want to hear more stories like this, filled with emotion and life lessons? Then subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any updates. Here we always bring you narratives that make you reflect, feel deeply, and find inspiration. And before you go, check out the next video on the screen now. I'm sure it will also touch your heart and help you see new paths. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next story.